My name is Lauren Bennett. I am 35 years old. 4 years ago, my mother blindsided me by quietly pressuring me to help manage the financial records for our family home purchase, while hiding the full picture of the mounting loans and overspending she had already piled on behind the scenes. Now everything was colliding in this packed mediation room at our attorney's office in the suburban district outside Jackson, Mississippi, where my husband sat ready to finalize our divorce and claim every asset, while my mother leaned in across the table with that familiar cold stare, demanding I accept almost nothing. So the family reputation stayed protected in our tight-knit community. The mediator shuffled papers, but my pulse hammered, knowing this was the exact moment her long game met mine. I had waited 4 years with every document saved, and I was ready to end her control once and for all, no matter how much it cost me personally. If you have ever sat across from your own mother in a moment like that, wondering how someone who raised you could turn so calculated, drop a comment below with where you are watching from and what time it is there, because I read every single one. And it reminds me I am not alone in this, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back so you understand exactly how a daughter everyone wrote off as the quiet, compliant one actually spent years preparing for the day her own mother would try to erase her from the family picture entirely. My name is Lauren Bennett, and until 4 months ago, I thought 12 years of marriage had been the hardest chapter of my life. I met my husband, David Reynolds, when I was 18, right after high school, when I landed a part-time job as an administrative assistant at a local real estate office in our suburban neighborhood outside Jackson. My husband was 23, then full of big plans about building a stable life. And I believed every word because I was young and I wanted to believe in the future he painted. We got married when I was 19, and our son Connor came along the following year when I was 20. I kept working part-time while raising him, and slowly I built up my own small retirement account from those early paychecks, because even then, something in the back of my mind whispered that a woman should never put all her eggs in one basket. By the time I was 24, my husband's real estate ventures were finally gaining real traction, and my mother stepped in with her usual take charge attitude. She had always been the one in our family who managed the big decisions, and she insisted I reduce my hours to help coordinate the paperwork, contractors, and client follow-ups for the new properties. It was never a formal job title, just family helping family, she said with that sweet smile that always made refusal feel impossible. So I did it. For 8 years, I poured myself into supporting the business my husband was building, while my mother hovered in the background, offering advice that always seemed to come with strings. She would drop by unannounced to review the books or suggest changes to how we listed properties. And I let her because she was my mother, and I had been raised to believe family loyalty meant never questioning her input. Somewhere along the way, the lines blurred. My mother started treating the family home and the business as extensions of her own vision, and I was the one keeping the details straight while raising my son and trying to keep our household running smoothly. My husband got the public credit at every community event, and my mother soaked up the praise for being the supportive matriarch. But somehow my contributions stayed invisible. Then, 4 years ago, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, while my husband was out at a late client dinner, I sat down to reconcile the accounts like I did every month. That is when I found the first odd transfer, then another. By 3 in the morning, I had traced a pattern that made my blood run cold. My mother had been taking out additional lines of credit against the house without telling any of us. The original mortgage of $500,000 had been joined by a second mortgage of $300,000 taken out 3 years earlier, and then a third of another $300,000 just the year before that. Total owed on a home worth maybe $750,000 left us underwater by hundreds of thousands. The business was worse, with maxed out credit lines of $250,000 back, taxes of $95,000, vendor debts of $130,000, and equipment loans of $85,000. I sat there surrounded by printouts in the dim light of our home office and did the math. Total debt sat around $2.1 million, while actual asset value hovered near $1.7 million. We were $400,000 in the hole, and the money had gone to things my mother had never mentioned. Private club memberships, luxury trips she took alone, cryptocurrency bets that all lost, and even an apartment rental for a friend of hers that I had never met. It was not my husband's empire crumbling. It was the careful web my mother had spun for years, using our family as the collateral. My first instinct was to confront her immediately, but I knew my mother too well. She would twist it, turn it into my lack of understanding or my disloyalty, and then she would find a way to pull my separate savings into the mess. So I did not say a word. Instead, I worked with a trusted, retired accountant friend of mine to move my retirement account and the small inheritance from my grandmother into an irrevocable trust for my son. The money was legally protected, never commingled, and completely out of reach. Then I documented every single transaction, every loan statement, every suspicious transfer. I made copies, stored them in a safe deposit box, and saved encrypted files at my sister-in-law's house across town. And I waited. I waited while my mother continued to act like the family savior at every gathering. I waited while she criticized little things about how I dressed, how I raised my son, how I supported my husband's work. I waited while she turned small family disagreements into opportunities to remind everyone that she knew best. Everyone saw a devoted daughter and wife who was simply tired from juggling everything. No one saw the woman who had been carrying the weight of my mother's secrets for 4 years. When my husband finally came home one random evening 4 months ago and announced he wanted a divorce, he wanted the house, the cars, the business, and everything else, while graciously letting me keep my son, I almost laughed out loud right there at our kitchen table. He was not asking for assets. He was demanding liabilities, and he had no idea. What he also did not know was that my mother had been coaching him for months, behind the scenes, feeding him the narrative that I was the one holding the family back, that I lacked ambition, that I was the reason things felt strained. Within days, my mother showed up at our door with her perfectly styled hair and her perfectly practiced, concerned expression. She patted my hand and told me I really should have tried harder to keep my husband happy. Men have needs. After all, she said in that tone that made it sound like simple wisdom instead of the knife it was. My Aunt Pamela Hayes arrived the next afternoon to help me pack, or so she claimed. In reality, she went through my belongings, deciding what I deserved to keep and what belonged to the family legacy. Old clothes, fine. Some family photos, fine. But any jewelry my husband had given me over the years, any furniture I had chosen, those were off limits according to my mother, because they were part of the marital assets she now claimed we all needed to protect. The humiliation built fast. My mother canceled my access to the joint accounts we had used for household expenses. She suggested I find somewhere else to stay while things sorted themselves out, even though the house had been my home for 12 years. She packed my things herself into garbage bags, not boxes, because boxes would have been too dignified. Through it all, I had one person I thought I could trust, my longtime best friend, Sarah Klein. We had been close since high school, 20 years of friendship through every milestone. She came over with coffee and let me vent. She told me I deserved better. She asked detailed questions about my plans. Then little things started to slip. When I mentioned to Sarah that I was considering fighting for more in the settlement, my son came home the next day, repeating almost word for word what my husband had told him about how unreasonable I was being. When I told Sarah I was looking at apartments in a specific part of town, my mother made a pointed comment about that exact neighborhood being too expensive for someone in my position. It clicked. Sarah had been feeding information straight to my mother for months. My own best friend had chosen sides, and my mother had made her feel important enough to betray me. The worst part, though, was watching my son pull away. My 14-year-old son saw the girlfriend my husband started bringing around, the way my aunt packed my life into garbage bags, and the constant comments from my mother about how I was making everything harder than it needed to be. My mother worked on him every chance she got. "Your mother is the one dragging this out," she would say. "I am only trying to keep the family stable," but she refuses to cooperate. My son grew distant, confused about who to believe, and every time I tried to talk to him, my mother would insert herself with another perfectly timed remark that left me looking like the problem. I hired my own lawyer, Carla Mendoza, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney recommended by an old colleague. She reviewed everything and laid out the reality. "You helped build the value here," she said. "You are entitled to half." But I looked at her and asked, what if I do not want to fight the way everyone expects? Carla stared at me like I had lost my mind. She had no idea I had been planning this for 4 years. I moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment with my son. The space was tiny, half our boxes did not even fit, and they sat stacked in the corner like a reminder of how quickly things had shifted. Meanwhile, my husband posted photos with his new girlfriend, talking about new chapters and fresh starts. My mother commented on every post praising him for finally putting himself first. To everyone else, I looked defeated. I showed up to mediation sessions with tired eyes and soft, hesitant answers. I asked for so little that even the mediator seemed uncomfortable. "I just want enough to give my son stability," I said during one session. "I am not here to tear the family apart more than it already is." My mother sat in on every meeting because she insisted this was a family matter, not just a marriage matter. She would nod along when my husband made his demands and then add her own cutting remarks about how I had always been the one who struggled with ambition, how I should be grateful for the life they had provided. Each time she spoke, I felt the words land like small, precise cuts designed to remind me of my place. 2 weeks into the process, my mother started bringing my Aunt Pamela to the sessions for moral support, she called it. The two of them would sit together, exchanging knowing looks whenever I spoke. My aunt would casually mention how the community was already talking about the divorce and how important it was to keep things dignified. My mother would follow up with a sarcastic little jab about how some people simply did not understand the value of family legacy. I played the role perfectly. Broken, compliant, ready to sign whatever they put in front of me. Behind the scenes, Carla was preparing the addendum that listed every single debt tied to the assets. When my husband signed for everything, he would legally assume every mortgage, every line of credit, every obligation, exactly as my mother had encouraged him to demand. The night before the key mediation session, my mother sent me a text. "I am glad you are finally seeing reason. This is what is best for everyone, especially my son." I stared at the message for a long time. 12 years of marriage, 12 years of trying to be the daughter she wanted, and this was how she summed it up. I typed back a simple reply. "I just want what is fair." What was fair was the trap I had set 4 years earlier. Carla called me the next morning. "Mediation starts at 9. Are you ready?" I looked around my small apartment. the second-hand couch, the sage green paint I had chosen for the kitchen walls, because it reminded me of quiet hope. I have been ready for 4 years, I told her. That morning in the attorney's office, my mother arrived first. She wore her usual polished outfit, the kind that screamed respectable matriarch, and she greeted the mediator with warm familiarity. My husband looked confident, his new watch catching the light as he shook hands with his lawyer, Mark Thompson. My Aunt Pamela sat beside my mother in the gallery offering supportive nods. I arrived a few minutes later in a simple navy dress, hair pulled back, no jewelry. I looked exactly like the woman they all expected me to be. The mediator reviewed the proposed agreement. My husband would assume all marital assets in exchange for a modest cash settlement to me. My mother smiled across the table, the kind of smile that said she had won. Carla placed the full document package in front of everyone, including the detailed liability disclosure addendum. I watched my mother's eyes flick over the pages. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed her face. Confusion, then something sharper. She leaned toward my husband and whispered urgently, but I caught the words. The debts, the mortgages, everything is listed here. You need to read this carefully. My husband waved her off, impatient to get it done. My mother's voice grew tighter. This is not what we discussed. The room went still. The mediator asked if everyone understood the terms. My mother turned to me, her eyes narrowed, and delivered the words I had waited years to hear in exactly this tone. You always did love playing the victim, didn't you? She said, her voice dripping with that familiar sarcasm that cut deeper than any shout ever could. But this time, your little games will not save you from the consequences you helped create. You think you can walk away clean after everything this family has sacrificed for you, sign it all over, and stop pretending you ever mattered as much as you think you do. The mediator cleared his throat, but my mother kept going, her tone shifting into that practiced matriarch voice she used at every community gathering. We all know you have struggled with ambition from the beginning, she continued. This is why I encouraged my husband to protect what we built together. It is not personal, it is practical. My Aunt Pamela nodded vigorously from her seat beside her, while my mother's longtime advisor, Evelyn Grant, who had slipped into the room quietly moments earlier, added her own layer of pressure. For the record, we've reviewed the community reputation concerns, and any unnecessary fighting here would only harm my son's standing at school. My mother smiled thinly at that one, a small victory smirk that told me she had already looped Evelyn in to bolster her position. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, but I pushed it down because this was exactly the moment I had waited for. The liability disclosure addendum sat there in black and white, every mortgage, every hidden line of credit, every vendor debt spelled out in exhaustive detail. When my husband signed, he would take on the full weight of $2.1 million in obligations against assets worth only $1.7 million, and my mother had pushed him to demand it all. She had no idea I had documented her secret transfers 4 years earlier, or that my separate retirement funds and grandmother's inheritance sat safely in an irrevocable trust for my son, completely untouchable. But as the room waited for my signature, my mother delivered another jab, this one aimed straight at my role as a mother. You claim you want what is best for my son, she said, her voice low and venomous. But we both know your hesitation these past months has only confused him more. He told me just last week he feels caught in the middle because of how you refuse to cooperate. The words stung because I knew she had been feeding my son that narrative for weeks, turning my own son against me, one careful conversation at a time. We took a short break while the lawyers reviewed the final pages. In the hallway, My sister Nicole cornered me near the water fountain. She had always been my mother's shadow, the one who echoed every opinion without question, and today was no different. "You need to stop fighting this," she whispered, her voice carrying that same condescending edge my mother had perfected. "My mother only wants what is fair for everyone, and dragging it out is only hurting my son more." I could see Evelyn Grant standing a few feet away, pretending not to listen, but clearly taking mental notes to report back. The pressure was mounting from every direction, my mother's network closing in like a net I had not fully anticipated. When we returned to the table, my husband finally picked up the pen, his hand hovering over the signature line. My mother leaned in one last time, delivering her sharpest cut of the morning. "Remember," she said quietly enough that only I and Carla could hear, "this is what happens when you forget your place in the family. You were always the one who needed guidance, and now you are forcing us all to clean up your mess." My husband signed first, his signature bold and final. Then it was my turn. It was I signed slowly, deliberately, each stroke of the pen, feeling like both victory and risk, because I knew the addendum would bind him to every debt my mother had quietly accumulated. But as the mediator collected the documents, my mother's phone rang loudly, breaking the tension. She answered it right there in the room, her face shifting from triumph to something sharper when the caller spoke. It was a bank representative she had been dealing with privately about one final line of credit she had taken out 6 months earlier, without telling any of us a detail I had missed in my own documentation. Her eyes flicked to me, and in that moment I realized she might have one more card left after all. The call ended quickly, but the look she gave me across the table told me the real fight was only beginning. We left the mediation room that afternoon with the agreement sealed on paper, but my mother pulled my husband and my sister aside in the parking lot for a private conversation I was not invited to join. Evelyn and my Aunt Pamela flanked them like sentinels, and I drove home alone, wondering what new pressure she would apply next. The next 2 weeks became a master class in my mother's ability to twist the knife without ever raising her voice. She started calling my son directly after school, feeding him stories about how I had agreed to the settlement too easily, how it proved I did not care enough to fight for our family's stability. My son grew quieter around me, his 14-year-old eyes full of confusion he could not quite name. One evening, he came home from a visit at my mother's house and repeated her words almost verbatim. "Grandma says you could have kept more if you really wanted to, but you chose to walk away." The jab landed hard because I could not explain the full truth without risking the delicate protection I had built for his future. Carla warned me that any public pushback now could unravel the trust, but my mother knew exactly how to exploit that silence. She began posting on the local community social pages about new beginnings and family resilience, tagging phrases that everyone in our suburban circle outside Jackson would read as subtle digs at me. Another escalation arrived via text from Sarah, my former best friend, who had been feeding information to my mother for months. She wrote that my mother had asked her to testify in a potential follow-up hearing about my emotional state, claiming it was for my son's sake. Sarah sounded conflicted, but the damage was already done because my mother had turned even that friendship into another tool of control. I stared at the message for a long time, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of realizing how thoroughly she had anticipated my every move. My husband, meanwhile, started showing up at the apartment unannounced with my mother in tow, each time pressing for small concessions on custody or finances that were not in the agreement. She would stand in my tiny living room, her eyes scanning the second-hand furniture with open disdain and deliver another sarcastic remark. This is what you fought so hard for, a life this small, when you could have stayed and contributed properly. Each visit left my son more torn and me more isolated. By the end of the third week after mediation, the financial reality started biting my husband harder than he expected. Creditors began calling the house line my mother had insisted he keep active, and she used every call as fresh ammunition. She arranged a family meeting at her house one Sunday afternoon, demanding I attend for my son's sake. When I arrived, my sister was already there, along with Evelyn, who had brought spreadsheets detailing the mounting debts. My mother took center stage, as always, her voice laced with that biting contempt she reserved for me. "You see," she said, gesturing at the papers, "this is the mess you left us with by not stepping up sooner. If you had shown any real loyalty, we would not be in this position now." The words were designed to humiliate me in front of everyone, including my son, who sat on the couch watching the exchange with wide eyes. I held my ground, but inside I felt the first real cracks in my 4-year plan, because my mother had just revealed she suspected something about the protected trust, and she was not going to let it go quietly. That evening, after we left her house, my son turned to me in the car, his voice small and uncertain. "Mom," he asked, "why does Grandma keep saying you hid things from everyone?" The question hung between us, a direct result of my mother's relentless campaign, and it forced me to confront the painful truth that protecting his future might mean losing his trust entirely. I had one more meeting scheduled with Carla the following morning to finalize the last details of the trust disbursement. But as I pulled into the apartment parking lot, my phone lit up with a new message from my mother. It was short and chilling. "We need to talk about my son's future tomorrow before you make any more decisions. I know more than you think." The words sat there on the screen, a clear threat that she might have uncovered the one piece of my preparation I thought was untouchable. My heart pounded as I stared at it, because if my mother had found a way to challenge the irrevocable trust, everything I had waited 4 years to protect could crumble, and I would be left with nothing but the painful choice of how much more I was willing to sacrifice to keep my son safe. The next morning, I drove to my mother's house with that text still burning in my mind, and my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than they needed to. I had barely slept, wondering how much she really knew about the irrevocable trust I had set up 4 years earlier for my son's future. When I walked in, the living room felt smaller than usual, with my sister already seated on the couch next to my Aunt Pamela and Evelyn standing by the window with a folder in her hands, like she had been waiting for this exact moment. My mother did not waste time on pleasantries. She turned to me the second I crossed the threshold, her voice carrying that sharp, sarcastic edge she reserved for when she wanted to remind me exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. "You really thought you could hide something this big from everyone?" She started her words, slicing through the quiet room like she had practiced them overnight. "You always were the one who needed saving from your own clever little plans. But this time, you went too far, thinking you could lock away family resources in some secret trust without me finding out." The room went still, and my son, who had been brought over earlier by my mother, looked up from his phone, his 14-year-old face showing the confusion she had been feeding him for weeks. My mother did not stop there. She gestured toward Evelyn, who stepped forward and opened the folder, revealing copies of documents I thought were safely encrypted. A trust specialist I had never met before, a man named Richard Klein, my mother's latest advisor, had apparently been brought in to review everything, and he had found a technicality in the way the paperwork was filed years ago that could allow a challenge if we went back to court. My mother leaned in closer, her eyes locked on mine with pure contempt. You claim this is all for my son's protection, but we both know it is just another way for you to play the martyr and control what does not belong to you anymore." She continued her sarcasm, turning vicious. "After everything this family has done to keep you stable, you repay us by trying to siphon off what should have stayed in the family legacy. Sign a modification today, or we drag this into another hearing and let the whole community see exactly what kind of mother you really are." The threat hung heavy because I knew she had the connections in our suburban circle outside Jackson to make good on it. My Aunt Pamela nodded along, murmuring about how reputation mattered more than ever with my son starting high school soon, and my sister added her own quiet jab, echoing my mother exactly. Evelyn watched silently, but her presence alone reminded me how deeply my mother's network ran. Even the school counselor, Ms. Elena Vargas, had sent a follow-up note that morning, suggesting a joint meeting which my mother had already scheduled without asking me. A fresh escalation hit when my phone buzzed again right there in the room. It was Carla texting that she had just received notice from my mother's team requesting an emergency review of the trust documents before any final disbursements. The timing was too perfect, and I realized my mother had been one step ahead the entire time, building her case quietly, while I thought I was the one preparing. My son shifted uncomfortably on the couch, and my mother seized the moment, turning to him with that practiced, concerned tone she used so well. "See, sweetheart, this is why we have to step in now." She told him, her voice soft, for his benefit, but laced with the same resentment when she glanced back at me. "Your mother's choices have put us all in this position again." I felt the weight of 4 years of silence crashing down, because fighting now would mean months of court battles, draining what little I had left and potentially costing me even more time with my son. My mother delivered one final jab as the room waited for my response, her words dripping with long-held resentment. "You never understood that family comes first," she said, poor sarcasm cutting straight to the bone. "You always played the quiet, supportive one, but deep down you were only waiting for the chance to walk away and leave the rest of us to clean up your mess. Now, you have to choose what matters more, your pride or your son's actual future." The choice she forced on me was the painful one I had dreaded. To avoid a prolonged legal war that could expose everything and leave my son caught in the middle even longer, I agreed to modify the trust terms right there at my mother's dining table. I signed over a portion of the oversight to a neutral third party my mother had pre-selected, effectively giving her indirect influence through Evelyn and the specialist. It was not a full loss of the funds, but it meant the protection I had built in secret was no longer completely mine to control, and my son's future would still carry some of her shadow. My husband was not even there, because my mother had handled the details herself, as always, positioning herself as the one who fixed what I broke. In the weeks that followed, the modified agreement went through without another hearing, but the emotional cost settled in heavy and permanent. My son started spending more weekends at my mother's house, where she continued to shape his view of the divorce, painting me as the one who had given up too easily. He grew distant during our time together, his answers shorter, and his eyes carrying questions I could not fully answer without risking more conflict. I kept the small cash settlement I had negotiated and enrolled in night classes at the local community college to finish my degree in business administration, something I had put on hold years ago to help with the family real estate work. But the independence felt hollow because my mother's influence lingered everywhere in our tight-knit suburban community outside Jackson. Sarah stopped reaching out entirely after my mother made it clear whose side the community should take, and even my Aunt Pamela sent one last message reminding me that family events would be easier if I kept a low profile for now. The final twist came 2 months later when my mother called me directly one evening, her voice carrying that familiar cold sarcasm even over the phone. She informed me that she and Evelyn had arranged for my son to attend a special summer program through her church group one that would keep him away for 8 weeks and give him the stability he needed after all the upheaval I had caused. I could have fought it, but another battle would have meant more modifications to the trust and more strain on my son, who was already struggling to adjust. So I agreed, again choosing the lesser evil of limited contact over watching him get pulled deeper into her narrative. That decision left me sitting alone in my small apartment one quiet evening, staring at the sage green kitchen walls I had painted myself as a symbol of new beginnings that now felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. My mother had not collapsed under the debts the way I once hoped she would, because she had shifted enough responsibility onto my husband and used her connections to restructure things quietly while keeping her matriarch status intact in the community. I had prepared for 4 years, documented everything, protected what I could, and still ended up making the painful choice to sacrifice full autonomy just to shield my son from worse fallout. My mother remained the one everyone turned to for advice, the respected figure who had guided the family through the difficult divorce, and I became the daughter who had stepped back, the one who chose a quieter life, because fighting her fully would have cost too much. My son still called on Sundays, but the conversations felt guarded, like he was repeating lines my mother had suggested, and I knew the bond we once had was frayed in ways that might never fully mend. I walked away with enough to start over my classes, my small space, and the knowledge that I had tried my best. But in the end, her control ran deeper than any secret plan I could build. It was not the clean break I had imagined, it was the heavy realization that sometimes preparation is not enough when the person holding the power has been playing the game longer than you have. The lesson I learned in all of this is that no amount of quiet patience can fully protect you from someone who sees family as something to manage rather than something to nurture. I chose myself in the only way I could by setting the boundaries I had left, but the cost was real, and it still aches on nights like this when the apartment feels a little too quiet. Thank you for listening to my story and staying with me through all the messy parts of what happened. If you have ever faced a situation where you had to make a painful choice to protect what mattered most, even when it meant walking away with less than you deserved, drop a comment below with your experience, because hearing from you helps more than you know and reminds me the isolation does not have to be forever.